Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the podcast, thanks for joining us today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. I've really been looking forward to today's episode because we're going to be focusing on one of the single most important things we can learn how to do if we care about living a good life, and that's changing our perspective. How we view ourselves, other people, and the world around us has a huge impact on the emotions that we feel, the choices that we make, and the quality of the lives that we lead. Our perspectives are a bit like black holes. What I mean by that is that they exert so much gravity, they have so much influence over our lives that they can actually become kind of invisible to us, which is why changing them is both so high impact and often so difficult for us to do. So to help us learn how to do that, I'm joined by Dr. Rick Hanson. Rick is a clinical psychologist, a best-selling author, and he's also my dad. So Dad, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, Forrest, and I'm excited. And it seems that very typically you to go to the meta level. So we're going to be exploring wise perspectives about having perspectives.
This is a very classically Being Well move of us over here. But before we get into it today, I do want to give people a quick reminder about your upcoming Neurodharma course, which is an online program launching in early October. And it's focused on developing 7 key qualities that help us steady the mind, warm the heart, and find a reliable sense of inner peace. The program includes 3 live sessions and around 30 hours of total content. It's a great offering. And if you'd like to learn more, I've included a link to it in the description of today's episode. And if you end up signing up, you can use the coupon code BEINGWELL20 for 20% off the purchase price.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, Forrest. And the Neurodharma material, as you know, is extremely close to my heart. So I'm glad you mentioned it, and I really hope that people join us.
So I'd like to start by asking you, I think an important question here. What does having a healthy perspective mean? Like, what does that look like in practice to you?
Well, I think we ought to start with what do we mean perspective? And I want to give some examples of perspectives. The first one is the story we tell ourselves or the story we tell about other people, the narrative frame. There's a lot of research that humans represent knowledge about the world, particularly related to other people, in a story frame, a narrative frame. And there's also a lot of evidence that those initial frames that we create, those initial narrative structures, tend to be very sticky. They're hard to change. They resist change. And we tend to slot new information into those familiar frames. A story along the lines, let's say, of I'll never find love, or a story along the lines of everybody else is really stupid. Different stories. That's an example.
Totally. And then anything that happens to you gets filled in, all the blanks get filled in based on that story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Another aspect of perspective is a framework, including in object relations, the framework of self and others, self and world, self and object, in other words. So, for example, there could be a framework in which others are seen as big and powerful and overwhelming, and the individual is small, beleaguered, helpless, defeated already. Those particular frameworks, as well as narrative frameworks, are often rooted in early life experiences in which we take the experiences we're having, the brain literally indexes across multiple episodes of life and looks for what's invariant across episodes, looks for what's consistent, and then forms that into a rule, an expectation, and then starts slotting information into that framework. It's an efficient way to survive Jurassic Park, and certainly the Stone Age, but it can create rigidities that are problematic. And then, if I could, I'll just finish with 3 other aspects of perspectives. Meanings. What are the interpretations? How do we interpret events? Next, what are the appraisals? How do we appraise different situations in terms of how we understand them and how we highlight what's important in them and what doesn't really matter? In other words, do we fasten on, let's say, one bit of criticism in a large body of otherwise entirely positive feedback that we've gotten? And then last, attributions. What do we attribute? What qualities, what emotions, what mental processes, what attitudes, what intentions do we attribute to other people, for better or worse? So these are different aspects of what we're going to be getting into here. And you can see immediately that these perspectives are right at the front end of the processing stream and really shape how events land on us and how we react to them.
Great overview of what's in a perspective and what we mean when we say a word like perspective, and just the influence that this can have over our lives. And so when I was thinking about this and putting this episode together, I talked with you a little bit, and I also did a little thinking myself about what does it mean to have a healthy perspective? Like, what's in a healthy perspective?
And what do you think?
Yeah, I think there are three things. Like, much as you had your 3-point attributions, appraisals, and meanings, I'm going to have kind of my 3-pointer here, and then let me know what you think about it. The first is that I think that any healthy perspective needs to be able to change. Psychological flexibility is like a major target in ACT. It's kind of one example of this. Is really important because life changes. Things happen. We have to be able to adapt. We want to be able to change over the course of a long life. That's really important. The second thing that I think is important, and it gets a little tricky to talk about this, is that the perspective is grounded in realism. And what that means is that it is loosely attached to what we might think of as objective reality. And when you start getting into what does it mean for something to be objective, it's a real slippery slope. But one example of this that is clearly not grounded in reality would be something like delusions or psychosis or things like that. So we want to get a little bit closer to reality if we can. And then third, and I think this is really important, and I'm kind of cheating here because a lot is included in this, but basically the perspective supports us. This means that it has a degree of self-acceptance and self-compassion in it. It nudges us towards more positive purposes and better ends, and it overall just supports our well-being. So there's this space that maybe we can explore a little bit where we are both realistic while also moving toward that perspective that's more supportive of us in general. So for starters, does that make sense? And what do you think about those three things?
Oh, it always makes sense. I'm thinking about the very first one, that we have to be willing to, put it in a certain Bayesian language, update our priors. In other words, that we need to have a fluid perspective. You know, the Jean Piaget, two kinds of learning. One, we assimilate new information, into familiar frameworks, perspectives. The other is that we accommodate. We actually shift our view. We budge. And among the various virtues, budgeability, appropriate budgeability. And I'm not talking about budgeting. I'm talking about budging. Anyway, appropriate budgeability, I think, is one of the highest virtues.
Yeah, totally agree.
Partly because it's hard. Don't we find it really admirable when there's someone we're interacting with and maybe we're arguing with them about something, or they've had a view for a long time, and then they come back to you later and they say, or maybe even in the heat of the moment, they just take a breath, stare out the window for a second or more, and come back and go, I hate to admit it, but you're right. Or maybe even they delete, I hate to admit it, but you're right. Yeah, and they budge. And how do we feel when they do that? We really appreciate it. Okay, next, I wanted to ask you why you slipped in that little slippery adverb loosely when you talked about your second point, that our perspective should be loosely related to objective reality. What do you mean by that?
So part of having a flexible perspective, I think, and we're going to talk about this probably a little bit more later, is understanding our own subjectivity. If we think that our perspectives are totally tightly linked to objective reality, it's actually really hard to change them. Because to your point about those stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we have, we're really bought into that story being true at that point. We're like, this is just immutable fact, whatever it is that I feel in this moment. So we want to have a sense of our own subjectivity, but we also don't want to go total relativism about this whole thing. We don't want to self-gaslight around this. If somebody does something bad to me, I want to be able to go to them and say, hey, you did this thing. And if they say, well, no, I didn't, then that doesn't mean that I go, cultural relativism up in here. I know what happened and I'm clear about it.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting kind of balance between some sort of a sense of what's objectively true with also an appreciation for just the subjective nature of our experiences in general, because it's that subjective nature that actually gives us the space to interpret something in different kinds of ways.
What's interesting to me about that is that it's hard for me to imagine a perspective that's useful for us that's not actually grounded in reality. And I love this line from you. I'm going to quote you. Yes, this is assuming that some form of objective reality exists, which is a hill I'm willing to die on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that one. I did like that line when I was writing it. I was like,
yeah.
Man, I think I am willing to die on that hill because people get sucked into a lot of conversations about like what is objective
That's right.
reality, are things objective, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I just think that like in order to have a conversation about this sort of thing, we need to have some sense of what could be objectively true, or that there is something that really did happen that way.
And I loved your last point that a healthy perspective supports you. And that makes me think about the combination of two things. Essentially, one has to do with truth, the other has to do with values. In other words, what is actually the case? That's the realism part, which is improved continually by our willingness to be flexible in the updating of our perspectives, right? It's also important, though, to have perspectives that reflect and support our values, such as kindness toward ourselves, such as compensating for and balancing the negativity bias by deliberately being aware of positive facts about ourselves, things like that. And also, let's say, if we have pro-social values, that we have perspectives that support recognizing the good in other people and treating them in good ways. So I'm really glad that you brought that element up about perspectives toward the end there, that they have a functional effect, right? They're there to promote survival and thrival, right? Surviving and thriving. Yeah.
I think that what tends to be the best odds strategy for most people in terms of how we think about a healthy perspective is essentially realistic optimism. We have a generally rosy view of what could be possible for us in the future. We try to look at things through a positive light, if a positive light exists, including looking at ourselves that way, while also being grounded in reality. We don't want to be totally up in the clouds. We don't want to be totally disconnected from everything that's going on, but we also don't want to be nihilistic and assume that everything's a disaster, because while assuming that everything is a disaster is a great way to avoid disappointment, it tends to be pretty demotivating, and it tends to move people away from the pursuits that end up turning out really well in their life. And I'm wondering, Dad, because you've worked with a lot of people around this kind of stuff, you've got a lot of time spent as a clinical psychologist working with people. Was it a common theme when you were talking to somebody where you were hearing what they were saying and you just thought to yourself something like, yes, this person has a real issue, they're dealing with a real problem, but man, if they could just change how they thought about this, it would just have a huge impact on their life? Was that something that came up commonly in practice with people?
I initially thought to myself all the time. Then I thought, well, 80% of the time. Then I thought, well, maybe 60% of the time, but a lot of the time. And I want to add that, and I know we're going to get into it. These perspectives have a purely cognitive element, and they are rarely the result of purely logical, Spock-like philosophical analysis. They're rooted in emotion and somatic processes in the body. They have a feeling in the body, right? And particularly the more powerful they are and the harder they are to budge, the more emotionally and somatically they tend to be rooted. So, including as a form of habit. We might think about perspectives as habits of thought, habits of mind. And then you apply to that all the ways that we think about habit and how hard it is to change habit and what helps to change a habit. Then we can apply that to perspective. Yeah, I can give you multiple examples. So I worked with a young boy once, very, very bright, gifted, bright kid who was very anxious. That's why he was in my office. And he had various beliefs, including beliefs about things like grass would hurt him. And he also had a certain perspective about himself as weak and frail. So right there, we have the narrative structure of self and world. And so if you're starting to budge a perspective, you can budge it in both locuses, both places, the views of the out of the world and views of self. Another person, body dysmorphic disorder, where your perspective is that you're ugly and unviewable and horrible, and you should kind of hide, not look in a mirror or anything like that. When in fact, you look like a perfectly reasonable, version of a human being. So these would be examples of different kinds of perspectives, including, I should add, perspectives about what other people would do or what the future would hold, the impossibility of dating anybody, at all reasonably adequate, the impossibility of, pursuing a life dream. These are different perspectives.
In the people that you worked with, were there common things that tended to get in the way of being able to look at a situation in a new light or change a perspective in an even bigger way than that?
One is a topic you focus on a lot, appropriately: fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear.
Yeah, totally.
Perspectives are like these structures we hold on to, like buoys in a raging sea or docks. We hold on to them. And there's a fear that if we let go of those beliefs, those viewpoints, right, those expectations, those interpretations, if we let go of them, we're going to be swept away by the chaos of life. That's one. Second is that there were payoffs of various kinds. In other words, in addition to the avoidance of the bad, there was the perpetuation of the good. What's the payoff? What's the reward? What's that perspective doing for you? Right? How is it helping you to feel superior to other people, for example? How is it helping you to maintain a kind of, equilibrium inside the bars of your invisible cage? What's the payoff there? I saw that. And then more generally, to be able to change your perspective, you've got to decenter. You have to step back from it. And that itself is hard for many people. And that's why a fair number of therapeutic techniques will have people tell the story of their perspective, but almost as if it's in a third person view. They'll sort of get it out of themselves. One version of that is parts work. The different parts of ourselves inside us have different perspectives, and giving them voice actually tends to soften the intensity of their conflicts and reduces their hegemony, their control over a person, paradoxically. So we get them out in the open, we air it out.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. So yeah, these are these different things that can get in the way. And one of the things, therefore, that's really helpful for people is to, I guess, is to learn to tolerate perspectives dissolving and shifting. And when you find a shift of perspective that really is helpful and healing for you, value it, value it. There's a lot of psychology about disconfirming. In other words, technically, when a perspective comes into being, it is basically built anew in the neural substrates of consciousness from its seeds, as it were. And then when we kind of step out of that perspective or get away from it, it gets rebuilt in the structures of the brain. Well, during that reconstruction process, the window of reconsolidation, it's vulnerable to disruption. So a fair amount of therapy is about really highlighting those events, interactions, behaviors, and so forth that disconfirm a perspective. So you want to really highlight what disconfirms that old view, which then can disrupt the reconsolidation of that old view and not let it get so deeply rooted in your brain.
I think that's really helpful to just understand that as the basic process, and we're going to go into it a little bit more detail later, but the basic process by which we change your perspective is that you're getting a little bit of space from it. You're seeing the ways in which it might not be totally true, because one of the big things that stops us from changing our perspective is this kind of the lie that we tell ourselves about it, where we go, well, it's just the way things are. It's not about me, man. Don't you see that this is just the way things are out in the world? And I'm just living my life in alignment with that, right? When often, again, there are multiple different opportunities to see things in different kinds of ways, and we don't have to be as married to that view. And then you're looking for the examples of how something could be a little bit different. And then you're going really out of your way to either create those experiences for yourself or when they arise naturally to notice them and take them into you in a variety of different ways. I want to ask you about two other things that I wonder if they might be part of this process. And the first is other painful emotions like shame. Just in general, when people change, they tend to experience a lot of shame because shame is a social emotion. And changing tends to bring us into conflict with the groups that we're a part of. If I change in a way, I put pressure on the systems around me, whether those be family systems, social systems, things like that. Maybe you're surrounded with a lot of other people who have gotten used to you having a particular kind of perspective that leads you to behave in consistent ways. So then when you change that, your behavior changes associated with that. Wow, maybe they don't like that so much because you're forcing them to change in other ways around you in order for all of the puzzle pieces to accommodate each other in the big game of life over here. So I wonder about that part of it and how you've seen that be a part of the process or not, if you haven't, and also what people can do about that.
I think what you're saying is definitely true. And I'm thinking of two
Mm-hmm.
major ways I've seen it. One is what happens when people operate within the frame of a shared perspective with others. So think about people, and there are many examples increasingly in the media of people who grew up in a very fundamentalist kind of framework of any religion. Fundamentalism can be the case. And then in late teens or early adulthood, they struggled and eventually broke away from it. And it was very often extremely wrenching
Mm-hmm.
with lots of feelings of loss and real questioning, to use the general sense of shame, about your own worth, your adequacy, fears of being damned, if you will, breaking away. Definitely could see that. I also can see situations where for someone to change their perspective, sometimes it looks like admitting that they were wrong. Ugh. And
Yeah,
there you hold
totally.
shame. Shame shows up there too. And I too have experienced shame when I've realized, wow, I just got it so wrong. And especially when we burrow into our motivations for having gotten it so wrong. Was it just that we did not know some facts, or that we'd made some kind of error of logic, or that we'd been motivated because of various payoffs, or we'd been motivated in a way out of losing faith with ourselves, out of a kind of cowardice that led us to hold on to particular views. Finally, we realized, I've got to abandon that view, like letting go of a buoy in the seas, and you've got to swim on your own. I definitely have felt some shame and regret about, having clung far too long.
Yeah, one other thing I want to name here, and then we'll move on to what to do about all of this, kind of the more
Yeah.
practical part of the episode. But I do want to get this in because I thought it was really interesting when I was thinking about it the other day. I wonder about a lack of self confidence as something that can make it actually hard to be flexible, which
Yeah.
might sound a little counterintuitive to people, but when we're truly self confident, we believe in our ability to handle different kinds of situations, to deal with what the world throws at us, and to just kind of be able to go with it and figure it out. But if somebody doesn't feel that way, then they kind of have to be more rigid about the situations that they allow themselves to be in, the emotions they allow themselves to feel, all of that kind of stuff. And so I was just wondering what you thought about that.
I think it's right on. It gets at one of the big five personality factors of openness, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be open to inputs, open to new experiences. It is interesting just to kind of connect this with something that, I find interesting. Classically, around the world, it's found that people in rural settings tend to be more conservative
Mm-hmm.
than people in urban settings. Now, one reason is people in urban settings tend to be exposed to more views, but very often people in rural settings uh, have little control over many of the key factors of their economic livelihood, and previously, and maybe currently, sometimes their sheer survival. If they make a mistake, if they do something different, if they step away from tradition, right, it can be catastrophic for them. So, in other words, understandably, they don't have confidence that they can easily risk shifting a familiar perspective,
Great point there, Dad.
in-
Yeah.
rooted in tradition. Yeah, and so it's not that it's a neurotic lack of confidence. It's an actual realistic
Yeah,
lack of
yeah. It's like an
confidence.
accurate appraisal. Totally, totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. But that said, obviously in general, whether it's, hopefully grounded in realism, greater confidence does lead to typically greater openness and greater flexibility, because there's a sense that you can manage ambiguity, you can tolerate, not knowing, and tolerate uncertainty, and
Yeah.
find your way to a new clarity.
So now I want to ask you, Dad, as you've done this work with people, what are some of the big tools, and we'll go through several here, or the things that you've seen be really helpful in becoming more budgeable, as you were talking about earlier?
Well, I think the first one is has to do with what I was describing as decentering, that
Hmm.
capacity to step back from a view that you're embedded in.
Hmm.
Like the two fish, one swims by the other one. And the first one asks, "So, how's the water?" And the second fish asks, "What's water?" Right? Being able to step back from your views and knowing that you can. So I'd say that's the first one. That goes to growth mindset, self efficacy, self belief. Um, and I think kind of I would add a learning orientation that delights in discovering where you were wrong, and delights
Mm-hmm.
in the possibility of changing your fundamental frame of reference that you had so taken for granted, right? That loves that. So that when you have the first few seconds that someone is telling you something and it's starting to dawn on you, oh boy, there's a whole other way to look at this, right? That you ride that wave with joy.
Mm-hmm.
So these, I think, that would be the first
Yeah.
thing I
Well,
would
I just
say.
want to
That
flag that really quick,
orientation.
Dad, because it's so common when we
Yeah.
start to receive information, like you were talking about with Piaget earlier,
Yeah.
to immediately move into our perspective if our perspective is different from their
Yeah.
perspective. And we immediately
Yeah.
go to combativeness. We immediately go to resistance, to pushing it away. Can you stay a little bit longer in the world of possibility? Is like a useful question to
Yeah.
ask yourself, understanding that you still totally retain the right to step back
Yeah.
into your perspective and go, no, that one over there is not for me. So, anyways, keep on going.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Um, And as you've pointed out, there's a lot of emphasis in the culture about sticking to your guns, not being a
Yeah.
flip flopper. And I keep going back to Kane's comment, when the facts change, I change my mind. What the heck
Hmm.
do you do? Right?
Yeah.
And so that there's a great value in that. And as you said earlier, also in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, there's a premium on psychological flexibility.
Yeah. Totally.
Also, as you've pointed out, this psychological flexibility is embedded in a view that tends to be more process oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could say more about that. Thinking of ourselves as processes rather than bricks or things.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that like self-concept is kind of a sneaky part of this
Yeah.
whole thing. Like where are perspectives coming from, as you were saying earlier, Dad, the stories we tell about ourselves, the way that we absorb that kind of information. And when we conceptualize of anything, we can think of it as one of two ways, right? It's either changeable or it's not changeable. And it's really helpful to kind of go through and notice for yourself all of the things that you think of as being unchangeable. Like
Mm.
all of the things where you just go, that's just the way it is after it. Because my bet is that for most of the people who are listening right now, they err too heavy on the side of that's just the way things are, and not
Mm.
nearly heavily enough on I can do something about that. Because it's that stance of I can do something about that that allows us to move into real action about something. And one of the single biggest changes that I've made in my own psychology since I was 16 years old is this movement from a view of myself as kind of like a big rock. I just am what I am. I'm resting on the ground, take it or leave it. to much more of a river, to stretch our metaphor here. It flows, it changes, it goes to different places, it weaves around. You're just laughing at me, right? I'm just laughing at my
Please,
rock-like
some
nature.
listener, I want to see some listener who's got artistic skills. Send us in, please, a picture of a big rock that kind of looks like Forrest with arms sticking out saying, I am what I am. I want to see it.
If somebody wants
We'll
to do
post
it,
if someone does that.
We will put it on the Instagram if somebody wants to make it. Absolutely. But yeah, so like just this general view of people as rivers that flow, man, to get a little hippie-ish about it. But like, and that view in general is something that I think lets us do all these really cool things. It lets us get more comfortable with change broadly and kind of relax about the reality that other people are going to change, which sometimes we don't like so much. And also kind of reflect on our own past behavior and kind of like laugh and shake our head ruefully at it without getting like incredibly self-critical and inappropriately self-critical about whatever it is that's happened in the past. Because we understand that we're changeable things, we flow. Shit happens to everybody, however you want to kind of think about it. And so I just think that overall perspective can be really helpful here.
Yeah, in that for us is playfulness.
Yeah, I love that.
Creating a kind of distance between ourselves and our perspectives, and engaging the process of updating perspectives, even changing them fairly radically, playfully. Like, it's fun. And underneath it all, wow, it's very pro-survival.
Mm-hmm.
Because basically, it helps you get righter about things. The righter you are about reality, the more effectively you can operate inside it.
Totally. One of the things that we talked about recently that's had the biggest impact on me as like a little tactic, I forget, I think that you brought it up initially and then I kind of took it in a direction that I thought was really cool, is just various forms of role play, essentially role play with yourself, like the notion in internal family systems of acting from a part is sometimes how they talk about it, where you try to really bring that part of yourself into the room if it's being done clinically. So there's a role play aspect to it. And that gets to that playfulness that you're talking about, Dad. So if you're trying to change your perspective, one way to do it is to try to just ask yourself, what if? What if it were true that fill in the blank?
Yes.
Something that's a little different. Whatever that fill in the blank is for you. What if it were true that people actually liked me? What if it were true that I could change my environment? What if it were true that I could think about this a little differently? What if it were true that I could commit to this thing that I want to commit to? And then start asking yourself questions or thinking about what you would do if that thing were true. You don't have to totally believe it yet. You don't have to buy in.
That's right.
You just have to ask what if. We're just playing here. And some of the best choices I've ever made have been driven by a little bit of what if in there.
That's great. And it's related to this point we're still with, which is adopting the perspective that perspectives can change.
Yeah.
And that it's actually good for you. A couple of things I have found clinically and otherwise that are good tricks here, good aids here. One is to start paradoxically. It's kind of a jujitsu, Aikido kind of move where you really step into the perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You really get into it. Whether you're talking with someone, tell me more about why that's true.
You kind of join with the defense a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, you really get into it and you have to do it sincerely. And they tell you, I've been on 10 dates and, or I've been on 2 dates. Let's say, I'll just use that example. And they both were terrible. Oh, okay. And so I've concluded that dating is not for me. Oh, okay. Tell me more. And then you move into here's the first of the 2 tricks or the first of the 2 moves. You go, okay, what else is true? I'm not yet disputing the truth of what you're saying. What else is true? Just that question. What other information is out there in the world? What other facts are true? What other values might be relevant? What else is true? What else is true about others? What else is true about you? What else could be true about the future? What else has been true about the past? What else is true? It's a really good move. Another one is to bring to mind how other people might look at things in ways that are different. Oh, do you have a friend who is in a good relationship? Yeah, how'd they get there? Well, they went on whatever it is, some online service, and they dated half a dozen people and found someone really cool. Oh, what point of view might that person have, right? About the futility of dating in your case, right? And so that's another way into it too. How do other people look at it, including other people that are admired, that are reasonable, that are effective?
One way to say this is finding good models, like other models out in the world that you can kind of buy it into, go, that person is kind of like me in these various ways, and they've been able to do this thing that I'm currently having a hard time doing. Like what would I would do if I were them? Yeah.
Here's another thing I would do with people, and it's good to do in general, is to try to understand, how did you develop this perspective?
Yeah.
Which is also a way of decentering from it, because it's not mandated by divine order that you have to believe this way. It's not a universal view. How was it constructed? You start emphasizing its constructed nature. It was built, it was made. It's a human-made object, as it were. And if humans made it, they can unmake
it. Totally. Yeah.
How'd you get here? So I'll throw the ball back to you here. What are some examples that you've seen, Forrest, or read about in the literature in your deep dives about the factors that shape people's narratives, going back to what are perspectives, right? Their narratives, their object relations, their frames, right? Their meanings. Yeah. What shapes that?
There's a little bit of nature nurture stuff here. Some things are that if you pop out, we can pop out with certain tendencies. Some people maybe have just a underlying tendency. Sorry, did I catch you again? You didn't like pop out. Is that not?
We do not want the phrase pop out? We do not want that picture.
Oh yeah, do not. Okay. No. Nobody sent in a picture of that. All right. The big X, big no, big no. We will not put that. We will not put that on the Instagram. That's not going on. Not going on. Okay. Anyways, thank you for clarifying that. Jesus. All right. Anyways, so what I was trying to say, oh man, is that people what's a better word? People emerge into the world. No, not better. People whatever.
Come into the light.
Come into the light. People come into the light with maybe some underlying tendencies. Who knows? Tendencies towards introversion or extroversion.
Genetics matter?
Genetics matter a little bit. They do. It is what it is. And so those underlying genetic tendencies that we have might lead us to behave in different kinds of ways. Okay. Most of this stuff is driven by our experiences, and in my personal belief and my experience, the social circumstance that a person arrives in has different rules, has different statements about the way the world is. If you think about the difference in the experiences somebody might have growing up, being born where I was in Marin County in Northern California versus being born in rural Idaho, versus being born somewhere in Europe versus being born somewhere in Southeast Asia. Like, these are just going to lead to different views about the way that the world is.
Yeah.
None of them are necessarily more right or more wrong, but they are wildly different. And then there's your personal experiences, all of the things that happen to you, particularly the things that happen to you when you're young. There's your family system. There's the way that your dad related to you when you were growing up. There is the things that your mom asked for from you when you were growing up. There was that time when you were 9 years old and some other kid said that thing and it really rubbed you the wrong way. Like, it's all kind of stewing away in there. And I think that Freud was wrong about a lot of stuff. But one thing that I think Freud was probably right about was the notion of the return of the repressed and just kind of psychological material as being somewhat indestructible in nature. And what this means is that what happens to us matters, and it tends to come back in this sort of cyclical way. And so I think that all has a huge impact on what you're talking about here, Dad, with the narratives that we have or the stories that we tell about ourselves. And I really want to emphasize your point, which I think is super important here. If these are human-made things, they can be human unmade. And that's a really important piece of this whole thing in terms of seeing the kind of filmy nature of our perspectives.
I find it's helpful also, which goes to the decentering, the disidentifying aspect, to realize that a lot of our views of the world, we've been sold a bill of goods.
Sure.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's not true. Yeah.
Yeah. Forces that were biased or had their own agenda, it kind of implanted certain views inside us. And if we can start to approach them as what's called ego alien, like
Mm, mhm.
they're there in your mind. You're not schizophrenic, they were not implanted in some creepy way, but they're not you, right? It's
Yeah.
ego, alien, it's not me. Um, that's another way to help yourself start disidentifying from certain viewpoints. Uh, I told a friend of mine a long time ago, it just popped out of my mouth. I was this young guy and it was in college still, I think. And I said, if you feel guilty, someone is lying to you.
Hmm.
Now, that was a clever overstatement. It was an overstatement. But in her case, she was carrying a lot of guilt. And for her, it was revelatory. The notion that she could step back from the beliefs that were making her feel guilty and to realize that a lot of them were rooted in lies, in effect, untruths, I'll put it that way, well intended or not, untruths that had been um, communicated to her while she was growing up and even currently. So that's a kind of way of thinking about it too, in an extreme form.
Yeah, to pick up on what you're saying about that, Dad, some of what like perspectives are patterns. Is maybe a way to say this, right? They're a kind of patterning of our lives, a patterning of how we view the world. And so it's good to know as you're kind of stepping back and you're able to view those perspectives increasingly as these changeable things. They're patterns made up of patterns. You can start to recognize your own patterns and your own tendencies
Yeah.
inside of them. So for this person, it was really, really helpful to have a kind of absolute statement of if you're guilty, it's because somebody's trying to mess with you, because they just leaned so heavily
Yep.
into the pain of guilt and they were just excessively oriented that way. So for myself, it was really helpful for a while to have a perspective that Forrest, you just kind of talk too much. And that is something you got to keep an eye on. And that might have been true in some situations and not true in others, but learning to watch it was really helpful for me as a blanket statement. And that's maybe one small example of this. And then over time, I could let the gas up. I could be like, okay, I've started to internalize that as a new way of being. I'm better at recognizing when there are four of us in a room and I'm talking half the time when I should really be talking a quarter of the time. And now we've updated our priors and we can kind of let that rule go a little bit here.
It's great. It's great. It also helps to become better and better at tracking these little beliefs that are
Mm-hmm.
kind of embedded way down deep. You can sort of hear them murmuring away. It can even be a little shocking when you do a practice like you do an exercise where you write them down, or
Oof, yeah.
do a practice like sentence completions, which are one of the most productive psychological techniques I know. They're extremely simple. Basically, you just fill in the blank. Um, I am blank. I am
Mm,
blank. Other people are blank, blank. If I am vulnerable, blank. If I ask for what I need, blank. One good thing about uh, being closed up around others is one good thing about being closed up around others is whatever it is. It's a probe, and you can do it either in writing. You just make yourself keep filling the blank. One thing that's true about me is bananas. Whatever. You just fill in the blank, and
mhm.
that's a good way to become more aware of your points of view about things. And another one, which I find really helpful, is to enter the worlds of others in fiction, TV, movies. I have friends who puzzle me. They never read fiction or engage stories. They don't watch movies, they don't watch fictional programs. They just don't do that. And I think there's something im- impoverished when we don't do that. And it's such an incredible opportunity to read literature from other cultures, read voices, particularly ones that are really divergent from your own. Sometimes the more divergent, the more you learn from that different perspective. So these are different ways to become better and more skillful at identifying the pattern of your own perspectives.
Mhm. I also wonder about empathy here, just as a general
Hmm.
skill that can support changing a perspective. Because part of what you're speaking to there, Dad, when you talk about power of fantasy, being able to step into a different person to see things
Yeah,
in that new way, you have to empathize with them at least a little bit, right? You have to be able to put on the
that's
pair of
true.
shoes, in some kind of sense inside of
Yeah.
yourself, even if it's just on the level of imagining yourself in their life. That's a kind of empathy, right? Um, And so I wonder about the development of more empathic relationality or the ability to be empathic in that way as something that could support being able to change your perspective on something.
I think you're really naming something important for us about imagining your way into
Yeah.
another person. It could be the stranger sitting near you on the bus that you're kind of stealing a glance at from time to time. You're not stalking them, you're not being creepy, but you're just, imagining your way into what is it like to be them. Uh, or you're reading a fictional character, or you're watching them on TV, and it's a good program or something. You're getting into it. I mean, that's
Mhm.
the kind of empathy I think you're talking about. I think of empathy as emotional imagination. That's
Yeah.
kind of my
Yeah.
two-word
Totally.
summary
It's a
in
great
a
way to
way.
put it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just it's a sensory but it's emotional imagination at bottom. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one perspective that really changed for me that
That'd be great. Yeah.
was, yeah, it came upon me kind of unbidden. And this is the way it sometimes happens for us. Uh, and essentially, it was the realization in my mid 20s that growing up, I had been a nerd, but not a wimp. It really was a way to take the same set of facts, but to put them in a different framework. When this revelation came to me, it's as if I retold my story. And that's, by the way, one of the more powerful techniques developed, I think, by David White and others out of Australia, narrative therapy, where you do the exercise of telling the story in a different way. And suddenly, I just saw all these episodes of when I had actually been sturdy and strong and fought back and been determined and tough and played the game as best I could as a skinny young kid with not many cards in his hand. And I think that's a really important thing for people to contemplate on, including to make themselves tell their story differently, and deliberately as a counter. What's your typical story?
Mm, mhm.
If your typical story is that others are unreliable, can you tell a story of your life in which others did come through for you accurately? So you're not making up anything. You're just interpreting the same set of facts, but in a different way, right? Or tell the story of your life that's a story of triumph.
Mm.
It's a story of learning, a story of overcoming, story of, the phoenix rising from the ashes. That's a different kind of narrative frame. It really is very, very powerful. Tell the story that you're a fundamentally loving, good, decent, kind person who keeps trying. That's a good way to shift the narrative you have about yourself.
I wonder something that's maybe running under all of these things that we're talking about as being supportive of the change in the perspective process. And it's just a basic form of mindfulness, a basic
Mm,
degree of mindful awareness of both what's going on in you and what's going on out in the world. Because we talked about stepping back from things, that can be a mindfulness practice. We talk about observing reality as it is, that's a mindfulness practice. Self monitoring, which is a phrase that's used in CBT sometimes, is basically a form of mindfulness, noticing when and where and how our different thoughts appear to us or why they appear. And so, if you're somebody where that's a meaningful practice to you, that's another great resource to lead in for being able to change how you view a situation, is cultivating more mindful awareness around it, including something we've talked about in past episodes, trying to get a closer and closer to right now, however it is for you. I've had a lot of experiences recently where I've been wrapped up in different kinds of problems or
mm,
preoccupations. And so I've really been applying this actively in terms of trying to get
oh,
more and more into the moment, which
yeah.
those problems and preoccupations are almost never there. They normally live in either the past or the future. And so that's been very useful for me personally.
That's really great.
As we kind of come to the end here, Dad, or get toward the end of this conversation at the very least, I'm wondering, what do you think about the role that values or aspirations of different kinds can play in this sort of a process? Because the view that we have about something is often driven by different kinds of values that we have around it. And so I wonder about exploring what matters to us as a way in to working with our perspective, and if you've done that with people, maybe what that looked like.
That's a very deep question and opens kind of a portal to a lot of stuff in that I think that what people do is the net vector sum of all the various things they want. In other words,
Mm.
you can imagine a box with a bunch of bungee cords in it of different lengths and different tensile strengths. They pull at different amounts of elasticity, and so they're pulling in different directions. Those are the different vectors of what you want, pulling you in different directions. And the center of it all, and they're attached, like they all have a hook at the end, and they're attached at a single point in the center. And the combination of all those pulls basically shapes the location of the ball at the center, which is what we do at each moment. That's the sum of all the various things we want. You want to know what people really want? Watch what they really do. So there's a way in which that our wants shape our perspectives.
Yeah,
Our
totally.
perspectives arise in the surface of our wants, or broadly our values or motivations.
Or maybe one version of this, a view around what's been denied to us can be a way that a perspective can really form out of that. Like the wants that we have, but that we feel
Yeah.
have been unrequited in different kinds of ways can really impact our perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking at it the other way, though, so here I'm talking about how our wants, including our values, produce perspectives that serve them, right? You want to be emotionally safe? Well, develop a perspective that other people are unreliable and you can't ever really open your heart to them. You want to be the big dog, dominating? Well, develop a perspective that other people are dumb and that you know more and you should be the big boss. Okay. Goes the other way, though, too. Sometimes people have certain, sometimes pretty rigid beliefs, and then they start shaping their values in the service of those beliefs. What's important to them becomes what maintains those beliefs. So it can kind of go both ways. That's why I think your question there, as usual, is really very heuristic. It's catalytic. It really takes us into a deep place.
Totally.
So
totally.
Maybe bringing it down to earth, it's a really good exercise, and one that I'm actually kind of in the middle of right now myself, to identify something that's actually really important to you. And yet maybe it hasn't had as much power in that box, as much pull in that box as you really would like it to have. But the heart of you, the core of you knows that this thing is really important to you, whatever it might be. And then you could ask yourself, which of my various perspectives support that which is really important to me? And which of them don't? And what might be some new perspectives
Yeah, this is
that
totally
would
what I'm
really,
talking about.
support that which is really important to me? Someone who's, let's say they really want true love. They're in their middle age. Maybe they've had it and now they don't have it, or they never had it, and it's really important to them. Okay, what are the perspectives that would really make it more likely to fulfill that want, the thing that's really important to you? And then deliberately help yourself start to acquire those other perspectives in relationship to this thing that you deeply, truly, really, existentially even want.
Yeah. I think that's a great practice and has been really helpful in my life, particularly now as I wander toward middle age. I referred to myself as middle-aged the other day, and you and Mom had a mild conniption fit between the two of you. You were like, middle-aged? You're not middle-aged. I was like, well, I'm 35, guys. Where's the cutoff here, So as I kind of wander into that, really going through a process of identifying what matters to me at this point in my life, that might be different from what mattered to me when I was, 16 or something like that.
That's true. But really, it was tongue in cheek. I remember teasing you a couple years ago. I said, Forrest, you're in early middle age.
You're like,
you
hit me with that one. Yeah. So the shoe was on the other foot here for a second.
Yeah. You're heading toward 36.
Yeah. October, man. Terrifying. Well, maybe we'll do another episode on midlife crises and aging, depending on how it goes for me. But I think that this was really wonderful. I really enjoyed today's conversation, Dad, on how to change your perspective and thinking about perspectives in general, and just really appreciated all of the various tools that you contributed here and the ways that we talked about it. So thanks for doing this today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We began today's conversation by talking about what a perspective is and also how we get them. And there are all kinds of different things in a perspective. These include things like mental frameworks and cognitive biases, our belief systems, the ways that we think that the world works, our emotions, different kinds of cultural and social systems. All of these things influence our perspectives. And Rick broke it down to these three key things: meanings, appraisals, and attributions. So, the meaning that we give different things, how we appraise situations, and then the intentions that we attribute to others. So, an attribution is determining why something happened. It's the process of cause and effect. While an appraisal is our cognitive or our emotional evaluation of the situation, it's determining what this means for me. And our perspective is going to influence both what we think happened, why we think it happened, and the impact that it has on us. It shapes all of those things. And that's why our perspectives are so powerful, and therefore why changing them is such a powerful tool. So, then what does it mean to have a healthy perspective? To me, healthy perspectives have three key things. First, they're fluid, not fixed, because the ability to change is a good thing in a changing world. Second, they're grounded in realism. And this includes ideas like reality testing, which is an idea from psychology where we are able to appraise accurately what's going on in the world around us. And then finally, a healthy perspective supports us. It includes some self acceptance, some self compassion, some self worth, a belief that we really can change the world around us. And it just nudges us down the road that ends up leading to the things that we really care about. We then spent a little while talking about what tends to get in the way of creating a healthy perspective. And Rick mentioned things like fear, emotional pain, also. I mentioned shame and the ways in which shame can get involved in this process. Then there are things like the "but it's just true" fallacy, where people believe that their appraisal of reality is completely accurate and they're just seeing things just the way that they are, as opposed to having any space inside of that perspective that could lead to it being changeable. Then I also mentioned the importance of self confidence in this whole thing. And we're going to do an episode on self confidence as our next episode, which is part of why I was thinking about this. But if you aren't very self confident, it's actually really hard to be flexible because you're not sure that you can handle different kinds of situations. You don't believe in yourself in that way. Whereas people who have more self confidence have the freedom to be flexible because they know that they're going to be basically okay regardless of what happens. And so, a great way to become more flexible in our perspectives is by actually developing more self confidence. Then we spent the rest of the conversation talking about how we can become more budgeable, as Rick said, and some of the particular tools that people can use to become more psychologically flexible. The first of these is to frame flexibility as a good thing, and alongside that, to think of yourself as a changing process over time rather than a finished and fixed product. And this was when we were laughing about the image of me as a rock with the arms popping out of it, and increasingly thinking of myself as a kind of river that moves over time. Then, really importantly, we can go back through our personal history and unpack why our perspectives are the way that they are, because turns out perspectives are changeable. They are not absolute facts about the world. And as we increasingly see our perspectives as this human made thing, it becomes easier and easier to get some space around and inside of them. They were made by people, they can be unmade by people. They aren't absolute facts. Then we can get better and better over time at identifying the patterns and the habits of thought that we have that are based on different kinds of perspectives. We could get really good at going in and go, that thought appeared inside of my head again. Where was that thought coming from? Is that thought actually true? Does that thought have any relationship with reality? And this is very closely connected to a CBT process called cognitive restructuring. So if you're familiar with CBT, that might be coming up for you here as well. And I'm not an expert on CBT, but that's just my understanding. Then there are some other specific tactics that people can use to get to the bottom of their perspectives and start to rebuild them in ways that might be more beneficial for them. And one of the questions that Rick always likes to ask is, what's the payoff? What are you getting out of your perspective right now? Does it give you a feeling of superiority? Does it give you a feeling of assuredness? Does it protect you from certain kinds of painful emotional experiences. These are all payoffs that we might be getting even from perspectives that seem like they are not in our own best interest. Then we talked about various forms of role play, the ability to ask the question, what if? The ability to maybe act from a part of you rather than the whole of you. And this playfulness can be really, really helpful because play is inherently flexible. At the very least, good and healthy forms of play are inherently flexible. They require us to get imaginative and creative and see the world in a little bit of a new light. One example of this that Rick mentioned was sentence completion, writing out a series of sentence stems and then filling them in with whatever occurs to you first. For example, a statement like, I am fill in the blank. The world is fill in the blank. He is fill in the blank. She is fill in the blank. Because you can start to see what your real tendencies are, what you actually think when you're not filtering. And that can give real insight into a perspective that you're carrying about the world that you might not even be totally aware of on the surface. Finally, something that I want to mention here that we didn't really talk about very much, but that Rick mentioned offhandedly was journaling. Journaling can be a really powerful tool for figuring out what our perspectives are and breaking them down a bit over time, particularly different kinds of tracking. Tracking is just going through and making a note of when something happened, right? You can track anything. You can track how often you said a certain kind of word, how often you had a different kind of thought, how often you did the dishes. And most people absolutely hate tracking. Tracking makes people very uncomfortable because it forces us to really sit in the reality of what's going on. When we're not tracking something, we can kind of deceive ourselves a little bit about what's really going on. But when we start that meticulous process of really writing it down, that can feel very uncomfortable. But it's a really powerful tool here. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you've been enjoying the podcast for a while now, but you haven't subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it now on. It really helps us out. If you wanted to take a moment to leave a rating and a positive review as well, particularly on iTunes, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. The algorithm absolutely loves that. Maybe some way that you've changed your perspectives over time. And if you'd like to support us in other ways, you can join us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for just a few dollars a month, you can support the show and receive a bunch of bonuses in return. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.